Hello everyone. It's a pleasure to see you all again. The chill that ran down Carlton and Nicole's spines didn't come from the night air or the quiet inside the house, but from the moment they were forced to accept they had been living beside a fracture for far too long without ever seeing it. When the final piece clicked into place, everything flipped like a ruthless table turn. Kial wasn't some harmless wanderer who had stumbled into Fairmont Crest on luck or someone's pity. He was a real link in Plasma Ring, an organization that survives by turning the communities that think they're untouchable into the easiest places to manipulate. The shock wasn't just his identity, but the feeling of being penetrated for so long, so deeply, that Nicole began to doubt even her own memories. The things Kial once said that sounded ordinary now became blades, sharp and reversed, aimed straight at her confidence. She realized she hadn't only been deceived, she had been guided, trained into habits. Her instincts slowly dulled day by day, as if the plan had been written in patience and an intimate knowledge of human psychology. It was the kind of betrayal that makes you furious not only at the betrayer, but at yourself for ever believing, for ever letting the smallest signs pass. Carlton didn't have the privilege of being stunned for long. His anger didn't explode loudly, it thickened like smoke, creeping into every thought until his vision narrowed. He understood they weren't facing a lone criminal, but a disciplined network with structure, with hands that could reach into the places people assumed were safest. In his mind, every trivial detail they had once dismissed now flared into warning. The accidental encounters, the moments when Kial knew too much, the stretches of time he vanished and returned with explanations just convincing enough to make people nod and move on. What enraged Carlton most wasn't that Kial was skilled, but that he himself had once been sure he was too sharp to be led. He had spent his life reading motives, defending himself in power games, and still he had allowed a man branded by Plasma Ring to sit in his light. Nicole had to lean on Carlton to trace the trail, not because she was weaker, but because she knew that in this kind of game, anger without control becomes a fatal mistake. Yet even asking him for help stung, because it felt like admitting she had lost control and had to cling to someone else to save herself. They began to string the evidence together like assembling an image from broken glass. The house, once quiet, suddenly felt airless as each fact surfaced. Hidden transactions under layered aliases. Small payments that looked meaningless but repeated in cycles. Meetings that aligned too neatly with events inside Fairmont Crest. And signs of surveillance placed so expertly that only someone already suspicious would notice. There were gaps that had been cleaned with a perfection that was chilling, because it proved this wasn't impulsive crime, but an operation with command and design. Nicole stared at the evidence as if she were watching her own home stripped bare. She started to remember the sensation of being watched where no one should have been watching. The times a car's headlights lingered too long before rolling away. The way her phone sometimes twitched as if it had been interfered with. Before, she could have told herself she was overreacting, but now every fragment locked into a single red thread leading straight to Plasma Ring. Nicole's anger didn't point only at Kial, but at the entire system that had allowed him to exist. She had wanted to believe Fairmont Crest still held to some kind of standard, that wealth and gates and guards meant safety. Plasma Ring lived by mocking that belief. The more luxurious, the more sealed off, the easier it was to hide transactions. The easier it was to turn a stranger into a familiar face through a few layers of cover. Nicole wanted to scream from the insult, yet also wanted to shrink under the humiliation of being reduced to prey. What terrified her wasn't danger arriving, but the thought that Kial had mapped every weakness in her, knew what she feared, what she cherished, and used it to make her guard fall. When she looked at Carlton, she saw he was fighting the same shame, only he converted shame into counterattack, while Nicole was dragged into a poisonous cycle of self-interrogation. The deeper Carlton dug, the more he grasped something worse. If Kial could clean a crime so perfectly, then there had already been a victim before them, or there would be one after them, and that opened another layer of conspiracy. Plasma Ring wasn't only after money. Networks like this want leverage, ownership, the ability to control valuable people inside Fairmont Crest the way they control living assets. Carlton began to see the path clearly. Kial used proximity to collect information, used information to build leverage, then used leverage to trap them into silence. Some transactions touched names Carlton and Nicole never wanted to see in any file names that could ignite family wars, destroy reputations, or trigger power purges. That was where they were pinned to the wall. If they went to the police too early, they might trigger retaliation before they had enough proof, turning the people they loved into targets. If they stayed quiet, they became hostages to an organization that would never stop at one victory. If they handled it privately, they stepped into a gray zone where every principle could be bent until it broke. Nicole was stretched between two selves. One was the woman who wanted to do the right thing, to expose Kial and make Fairmont Crest face the truth. The other was the woman who understood the truth could kill her before it ever had a chance to be spoken. She wanted to believe justice could arrive quickly, but the evidence in front of her made it clear Plasma Ring had already planned for justice. Any move they made could be watched, redirected, turned into a trap. She burned with rage at being forced to think like a criminal just to survive. She hated the feeling of calculating outcomes while her morality was dragged across the floor. In her weakest moment, Nicole even found herself resenting Carlton for seeming calmer, for shifting into strategy while she was still drowning in emotion. And the instant that thought flared, she hated herself again because she knew Carlton was being torn apart too. He just hid it behind cold precision. Carlton, in turn, was haunted by a brutal thought. If Kial had been close to them long enough, then he had also had time to install an exit for himself and a snare for them. Carlton began to look at every corner of the house as if it had eyes. He checked routines, changed schedules, watched everyone who came and went with suspicion. His anger hardened into control, and that control pushed Nicole into feeling confined, suffocated. They started colliding with each other under the same fear, because each chose a different survival method. Nicole clung to her humanity, refusing to become what she despised, while Carlton focused on staying alive at any cost, even if it meant playing dirty. Kial's betrayal didn't only create an enemy outside, it planted a poisonous seed inside their bond, making them examine each other's motives, test each other's words, and wonder whether one of them had unknowingly become a tool for Plasma Ring. Then a small detail landed with enough force to freeze Nicole's blood. There were signs Kial knew they had discovered him. It wasn't direct proof, just a subtle shift in the rhythm of everything around them, the sensation that the house no longer belonged to them. Doors sounded heavier when they closed. The street outside felt closer. Every phone ring tight in the chest. The most frightening thing was the silence. Kyle didn't strike immediately, but that delay felt like a warning. He was choosing his moment. Nicole understood that if they had any chance to stay ahead of him, it was slipping away fast. Carlton understood it too, and he began pushing Nicole toward the decision she feared most. They had to set a counter-trap, create bait enticing enough to draw Kyle into the open, concrete enough to become evidence he couldn't erase. But bait meant risk. It meant someone would become the direct target. Nicole was furious and afraid because she knew Carlton might be willing to place her in that position if he believed it was the only way. And Carlton was furious because he knew Nicole might ruin the plan simply because she couldn't bear the cost of sacrificing even a measure of safety. In the end, the truth became a blade hanging over their heads. Kyle had already changed them, even before he touched them again. Nicole felt herself starting to hate weakness, starting to learn how to clench her teeth and lie in service of a bigger objective. Carlton felt himself sliding into a familiar shadow of power, where people choose outcomes over purity. Plasma Ring wasn't only threatening their lives, it was threatening the thing each of them was most proud of. And while they were still wrestling between right and wrong, between justice and survival, one shared realization squeezed the air from their lungs. Kyle would never let them keep the chance to tell this story. If they hesitated one more step, they wouldn't just lose control of the narrative, they might lose the right to exist inside it.